Good morning, Brevard Christian Church. Please stand as we praise God together this morning. Lord, I come and I confess, bowing here I find my rest, and without you I fall apart. You're the one that guides my heart. Lord, I need you, oh, I need you. Every hour I need you, my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Where sin runs, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Yeah. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Teach my song to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. When I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. There's a place where mercy reigns and never dies. There's a place where streams of grace flow deep and wide, where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in awe of you. I'm in awe of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white, I owe all to you. I owe all to you, Jesus. There's a place where sin and shame are powerless, where my heart has peace with God and forgiveness, where all the love I've ever found comes like a flood, comes flowing down. At the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in awe of you. I'm in awe of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white, I owe all to you. I owe all to you. Here, my hope is found. Here, on holy ground. Here I bow down. Here I bow down. And here, arms open wide. Here save my life. Here I bow down. Here I bow at the cross, I surrender my life. I'm in awe of you. I'm in awe of you. Where your love ran red and my sin washed white, I owe all to you. I owe all to you. I owe all to you. I owe all to you, Jesus. You may be seated.
Would you pray with me, please? Gracious Heavenly Father, as we pause right now and think of where we are in your presence, God, we know you're with us all the time, but you have given us instructions that we're supposed to meet together for edification, for encouragement, for an opportunity to praise, and God, just to grow. I pray that we would use this time as we interact with each other, as we continue to sing your praises, as we think about you, as we get into your word. God, may we be enriched. May we be closer to you as a result of being together with our fellow Christians today. God, would you please bless our time to that end? I ask in Jesus' name. 2 Samuel chapter 24, if you want to turn there, 2 Samuel chapter 24. We're finishing up our series through 1 and 2 Samuel, and we'll be getting there in just a little bit. While you're turning there, I want to read something to you. This is Adoniram Judson. He was a missionary in the early 1800s. In fact, I want to read you excerpts, just one little part of a letter that he wrote in the year 1810. I find that significant because Adoniram has not gone to the mission field yet. He's going to go to Burma. He's got his heart set there. But the problem was he met this young woman named Anne, and he was in love. So instead of going as a single man, he wanted to marry Anne. Well, in 1810, instead of talking to Anne about marriage, you went to her parents. You had to ask the parents, and often you would write a letter first just to prepare the parents. Here's part of the letter, the introduction, the opening part of the letter that Adoniram sends to his prospective in-laws, right? He wants to marry this girl, so here's what he says. He says, I have now to ask, this sounds so 1810-ish, right? So just put that in a proper perspective. I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world, whether you can consent to her departure and her subjection to hardship, to sufferings of a missionary life, whether you can consent to her exposure to dangers, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly throne and died for her? The letter's not much longer than that, but if you were the parents who received a letter like, what kind of response would you, what would you be thinking? And I'm asking myself, even as I'm reading this letter, as I'm reading about his life, couldn't you have had a little more finesse here? Why would you open a letter like this to somebody that you really want to marry and talking to her parents? Here's my best guess, and this is why I'm bringing this up. I'm guessing he was so committed to the Lord, seriously, and that he knew this prospective family were also so committed to the Lord that they knew good and well 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, which says, all who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted. In other words, he's just making the assumption, you already know this. Life's going to be difficult. Life's difficult for everybody. But when you become a follower of Christ, you actually signed up for some more. You signed up for this. And so he leads with that in his letter. Listen, God is very clear about this, and time again, he warns us that if you desire to live a godly life, you will face some persecution. Life's going to be difficult, but sometimes that difficulty is going to be compounded because you decided to serve the Lord. Listen, I hope that's not a shock to you, and I hope that's not detrimental in any way, because the Bible also tells us that some of those very hardships that we face, some of the difficulties that we're going to go through in life will actually make us stronger, richer, fuller, deeper. We will actually experience more joy, more reward, more fulfillment in this life because we're living it the way it should be lived. And along with that will come a lot of difficulties. In fact, that's the very thing that we're going to see here in 2 Samuel chapter 24. It's a lot of the challenges that come our way in life. But those challenges and those difficulties that we face actually make us stronger because, in short, it makes God bigger in our lives. Can I say it that way? We're more focused. Other things that get in the way and priorities that sometimes cloud our vision seem to kind of disappear in the midst of hardship, right? It becomes clearer why we're living and why we're doing what we're doing. God just gets bigger. And this passage, I think, has two lessons on getting God bigger in your life. Here they are. It's what you say and what you give away. Two practices that Christians have. Why? Because it helps God get bigger, even in the hardships. It's what you say, and it's what you give away. 2 Samuel chapter 24, I want to start with the very first verse, and I'll warn you right up front, the first verse is the hardest one for me to get through. It's going to take a little bit of time because I want us to make sure we have the setting here. 2 Samuel chapter 24 opens up, and it says, Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He's probably making reference back to chapter 21. Could have been making reference to a lot of different things, but chapter 21, Seth covered this last week. Children of Israel were in a lot of difficulty. Why? Because they did not keep their word. One of the things that God wanted them to learn is when you make a promise, when you make a commitment, when you say something, it's extremely important that you keep your word. The battle of the ages, folks, is the battle between the truth and the lie. And God's people have to stand for the truth. That was the previous lesson up to this point. The lesson that we're going to find here in this chapter, the end of the book, is God's got to be the biggest thing in your life. It says again, it's still in verse 1, it says again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, Go and number Israel and Judah. Go and count the fighters and the people that you have in Israel and Judah. I want you to notice here that it's not just David. He says the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he incited to David. Please remember that as we go through this passage. It's not just David, even though he's the key character here. The real problem was the children of Israel. And what was the problem? What is it that's going on here? They're counting. Well, what's wrong with counting? What's wrong with taking a census? What's wrong with seeing how much that you've got? Well, back in the book of Judges, we meet this judge by the name of Gideon. Gideon's going to fight against the Midianites. He's got 32,000 men. He doesn't think that's enough, with good reason, because the battle that he's going to fight is against an army that has hundreds of thousands. You've got hundreds of thousands on that side. You've only got 32,000 on this side, and God comes to Gideon and says, you've got too much. You've got too many men. And through a process of elimination, you can read about there in the book of Judges, through a process of elimination, he goes from 32,000 down to 300 men. With only 300 men, he's going to go out and fight at God's direction. And God makes it very clear at this time. Why? Why does he want him to go out to fight with only 300 men? Because if you went out with a larger, more troops, a larger force, you would tend to think, man, didn't we do a good job? Right? It was our strength. Listen, with such small numbers, one thing's going to be unmistakably clear. When you win, you're going to know you didn't do it. God did it for you. Do you understand why God's concerned when we count sometimes? Have you ever thought about this? What do you count? You only count what you own, right? Can I push this to extreme? If you came over to my house, Jack, and you started to open up my doors and started counting my stuff, I'd probably be a little offended. I'd probably say, what in the world are you doing counting my stuff, right? It's my stuff. I count my stuff. You go home and count your stuff, right? But if you went to my house and you opened up the drawers and stuff like that and you started taking inventory, if you were buying my house, that would make sense to me, right? Because you only count what you own. I hope this makes a little bit more sense, because when you read this and you're saying, what's the problem with counting? The problem with counting, especially you look at the last several chapters, is Israel was getting strong. When you get strong, sometimes you want to, hey, how much is the bench? How much can I do? What have I succeeded in? You start counting things and you start thinking, how great am I? Well, David does that. Remember, it's not just David's problem. It's all Israel's problem. Can I say it this way? It's not just counting stuff. It's not just thinking about yourself. God's not big enough, right? God's not the central thing. God's not the one that you're focused on. You focus more on yourself. So David does this. He counts, and then he gets to the point where he realizes what he has been doing is wrong. I want to pick up reading down here in verse 10. Verse 10. 2 Samuel 24, verse 10. But David's heart struck him after he numbered the people. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. I know there's a lot here, but there's something I really want to focus on, because David's a great example of this. It's one thing to realize you did something wrong. It's another thing to say it. This is a great example right here in the Bible of something you find time and time again in the Bible, and that's this: how important confession is to God. Can I back up with this and approach it this way? When your kids are little, this happens in so many different situations. It happens in a workplace with employees, right? When somebody messes up, you don't just say, hey, you messed up. You say, hey, do you realize what you did wrong here? Why in the world do you want to explain what an employee did wrong? Why in the world do you want to talk about that? Maybe so it doesn't happen a second time, right? Why in the world do you sit your kids down and say, hey, you're going to be punished. I want you to tell me what you did wrong. Right? Because a lot of times, especially if they're real little, they'll say, it's because you're just a mean person. And it's kind of like, no, no, that's not it at all, right? You said something that wasn't true, or whatever the issue is. You want them to confess. Why? You can't deal with things that you don't realize. You got to get it out on the table. And can I just be blunt here? This is one of the reasons why it's so important to have groups. I mean, any way possible, the Bible talks about fellowship, being part of each other's lives. You know what happens time and time again when people start talking? You know what you start hearing? Again, I apologize. I'm just going to be real blunt. So many times people are going to say, yeah, because this person did that, and that person did that, and they didn't understand, and that's why I'm in the mess I'm in. And it's kind of like, and you didn't do anything, right? Right? That's one of the reasons we're here for each other, because what does it say? James chapter 5, we're supposed to confess our sins to one another. I can't deal with my stuff until I get that stuff out on the table. Now, having said that, as important as that is, that's not the main thing the Bible focuses on when it talks about our confession. The Bible talks a lot about confession, and the main thing is not our sin. It's important. We've got to confess our sin. That's not the big thing. You know what the big thing is? 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul says to Timothy, here is the good confession. Jesus is King. What's the confession that you make with the mouth, according to Romans chapter 10, that's unto salvation? Part of that is what? Jesus is Lord. Here, listen. It's not just confessing, hey, I messed up. Hey, I did wrong. There may have been a whole lot of other people doing a whole lot of things. Here's my part. That's part of confession. The other big part of confession is this. God is in control. Listen, especially in the midst of hardship. And by the way, I know I blew over this in the very first verse, but sometimes those hardships come from God. Why? Because He wants what's best for us. Over in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, it talks about God disciplines like us like children, right? It says in verse 8 of Hebrews chapter 12, if you're going through life and you have not been disciplined, can I translate that? If you're living your Christian life and everything's great, can I just suggest you ought to be really afraid? Go read Hebrews chapter 12, verse 8. You know what it says? Anybody who hasn't undergone discipline, you haven't experienced the hardship, you haven't undergone discipline, it's because you're not a child of God. Boom. Well, that's big. In fact, if I understand Hebrews chapter 12 correctly, the whole point of Hebrews chapter 12 is whether it comes from God or not, everything that's hardship, I ought to look at it as an opportunity to be disciplined. Why? Because discipline makes you stronger. How does it make you stronger? Because it focuses you more on God. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul says we underwent all these hardships so that we could learn this lesson. That it's all about God. Right? What do I confess with I confess when I sin. I confess when I messed up. I confess when I didn't do what I should do. I got to get those things out on the table so I can deal with them. But here's the big thing. We all have to say this when we're going through hardship. God is bigger than this. God is Lord, even over the most difficult things I face. If I don't say that, listen, what you say resonates in your mind, shapes who you are. It's one of the reasons Jesus says, by your words you will be judged. What are you allowing yourself to say? Do you confess your sin and do you confess Jesus as Lord? Not just to become a Christian, not just part of direction of your life. Everything you face. Is God getting bigger? It's what you say. It's also what you give away. After David confesses this, there's a prophet who comes to him and tells him he's got a choice. Either they're going to experience 3 years of famine as punishment, 3 months of being chased by their enemies, or 3 days of a plague sent by God. David gets to choose. David chooses God. I think that's so significant. Shows us that he's learning the lesson here. I wasn't focused on God enough. He says, I don't want to run from my enemies. I don't want to be punished by their hand. I trust myself to God. So here's what God does. God sends an angel. Pestilence comes. A lot of people die. Can I remind you, back in the very first verse, this wasn't just about David. This is about Israel. A lot of problems that need to be dealt with. You know, sometimes these kind of passages are troubling to us, but you know what? God knows what He's doing. A lot of people ended up dying. David is grieved, but the death angel, the pestilence, the messenger through whom God sent it, stops. And when it stops just outside Jerusalem, at least at this time. Later on, it's going to be in the city of Jerusalem, but it's just outside of Jerusalem. At this time, they also referred to it as the Jebusite city. That's where the pestilence stops. Well, that's where the death angel, the one bringing the pestilence, God said, that's where it stopped. So the prophet tells David, you go and offer a sacrifice. So he does. He runs out there. It's at a threshing floor owned by a guy named Araunah. And that's where I want to pick up reading. This is in verse 21 of chapter 24. In verse 21, Araunah said he's talking to David, why has my Lord the king come to visit his servant? David said, to buy the threshing floor from you in order that I might build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people. Then Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges and the wood yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king said to Araunah, no, I will buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. I can't offer it to God if it doesn't cost me. You know, we have some really wealthy people who live in our area, right? Let's say the 20 richest people in Brevard County started coming to church here. In the first week that they came to church here, our offering was over $1 million. And then the second week, it was even more than that, which, by the way, way exceeds our budget. It would more than pay for everything that we have to pay and all the ministries that we're involved in. And we would probably scurry around and look for more ministries and more missionaries to support. But let's say the money started coming in so fast by these people that it was more than we could spend. Here's my question. Would we still take up offerings? Yes. I don't care how much money comes in. I don't care if it was in the hundreds of millions every week. That would be a whole nother problem. It'd be a wonderful problem, but it'd be a whole nother problem dealing with that. Will we still take up offerings? Yes. And there's an extremely important reason for this, because offerings are not primarily to meet needs. I just feel so convicted and so bad about this, because in the ministry sometimes it's as though we leave the impression, hey, we got to help this out, and we've got to do this, and we've got to accomplish that. Would you please give? Would you please support? Because we're leaving this impression that the main reason we want God's people to give is so that we can do things. Please hear me. That's one of the things we do with offerings. That is important. That is not the main reason we give offerings. You know why we give offerings? We give offerings to show God how important He is to us. That's why I don't care how much money is in the offering, I have to give. I can't give. I can't be part of a church that's already doing something if I don't have skin in the game, if it didn't cost me. Does that make sense? Let's review this with me. In Leviticus, the 5th chapter, it says, when God's people need to bring an offering, it's talking about a guilt offering or a burnt offering at this time, it instructs them they're supposed to bring either a lamb or a goat, right? But what if they can't afford that? Well, God makes allowance for that. You can't afford the goat or the lamb. You're allowed to bring 2 birds, 2 turtle doves, or 2 pigeons, right? So if you can't afford the animal, you can bring the birds. But what if you can't afford the birds? Even though birds are really cheap in that day, still, if you can't afford that, sometimes things are tough, right? You can't even afford the birds. So here's what it says. You can't afford the animal, you can bring the birds. You can't afford the birds, you can bring a grain offering. This is in Leviticus chapter 5. So if you can't afford the animal, bring the birds. Can't afford the birds, bring the grain. And so I'm thinking, like a typical American, what if you can't? What if you're really, really poor and you can afford a grain? It doesn't say anything about that. You know why it doesn't say anything about that? Because part of the Old Testament law was this. If you owned the grain field, you weren't allowed to collect all the grain. Why? Because sometimes people go through hardships. So if you owned the grain field, you had to leave it along the pathway in the corners of the field. There was always grain out there. So can I say it this way? If you can afford the animal, you're supposed to bring the animal. If you can't, that's okay. Bring the birds. Can't afford the birds, that's okay. Bring the grain. If you don't have any grain, get up off the couch and go out there and pick some grain. Sorry. There is a point here. And what's the point? Nobody gets away without making an offering to God. Why? Because it's not about meeting a need. I know you're going to say to yourself, but it's just a grain, it's just a few pennies. That is not the point. The point is, how important is God to you? That's really, really why. I don't know when you start giving an allowance to your little people. You give an allowance to your little person, one of the first things I really do think you ought to train your child is, how much of this are you going to give to God? But it's only $1. I don't care what it is. Here's a principle. It's got to cost you. Well, what does that mean? I'm hoping the house that you live in, we're all over the map here. Got people with all sorts of different sizes of houses, right? I'm hoping the house that you live in is not the house you could live in. You understand what I'm saying? I hope the car you drive is not the car you could drive. I hope the vacation you take in the entertainment in your life is not the vacation and the entertainment that you could have enjoyed. Why? Because I choose to live down here so that God knows there's nothing bigger in my life than Him. It's got to cost me. Why has it got to cost me? Because I got to make God the biggest thing in my life. If God's not the biggest thing in my life, life's going to crush me. Life's bigger than me, but God's bigger than life. That's why it's what I say, but it's also what I give away. I have to prove to myself, as well as to God, there's nothing bigger than you. And then it doesn't make any difference what you face. You know, David ends up buying this stuff from Araunah, pays him the price. You look over in 1 Chronicles chapter 21 and you get even more of the picture, because David didn't just buy this offering to present to God. He buys the whole area. And he spends a lot more money. You know why? I find this so fascinating. This is the place where they're going to build the temple. Why would you build a temple here? You know, when you put up memorials, when you designate certain places, there's usually a reason for that. Why would you choose a place like that? Well, because this is the place where the plague stopped. Can I suggest it's bigger than that? I mean, the temple, it represents where do you take care of sin? Only God can take care of sin. You come to a place where the sin is taken care of, where the plague stops. But the bigger picture here is, this is the place where we realize there's nothing more important than God. God gets big, and everything else gets smaller. I mean, can I just say it this way? Life's tough. You're going to suffer. Don't suffer for nothing. Let it draw you closer to God. And it can. It's what you say. And it's what you give away. And we're actually going to come to the place right now where the plague stopped, right? We come to the table and remember what Jesus did for us. Because if it weren't for God, we couldn't have a relationship with God. If Jesus hadn't come, we couldn't face anything in life. And you know what? None of the pain and suffering in life would make any sense. It wouldn't make any sense. But Jesus came, took care of it. And there's nothing bigger than Him. And that's what we celebrate right now, right? Would you pray when you're ready? Would you come to one of the tables and remember, this is where the plague stopped. There's nothing bigger than God.
bound for a cross. You willingly died. Your innocent life paid the cost. Counting your status as nothing, the King of all kings came to serve. Washing my feet, covering me with your love. If more of you means less of me, take everything. Yes, all of you is all I need. Take everything. I can't live without. Here at your feet, my desires and dreams I lay down. Oh, here at your feet, my desires and dreams I lay down. If more of you means less of me, take yes, all of you is all I need. Take everything. If more of you means less of me, take everything. Yes, all of you is all I need. Take everything. Change me like only you can. Here with my heart in your hands, Father, I pray, make me more like Jesus. This world is dying to know who you are. Shown us the way to your heart. Father, I pray, make me more like Jesus. Oh Lord, change me like only you can. Here with my heart in your hands. So Father, I pray, make me more like Jesus. This world dying to know who you are. Showed us the way to your heart. So Father, I pray, make me more like Jesus. More like Jesus. Make me more like Jesus. Lord, Father, I pray, make me more like Jesus. If more of you needs less of me, take everything. Yes, all of you is all I need. Take everything. Oh, if more of you needs less of me, take everything. Yes, all of you is all I need. Take everything. Thank you so much for being here, Brevard Christian Church, and have a great week.